friends. Hugs, fist bumps, high fives. Today is Monday, March 30th, 2020. And my circle question to start out today before we jump into another episode of Books with Bentley, Chapter 2 of our book, I wanted to ask you one question that's been on my mind a lot. So because everybody's home, and I've heard a lot from third graders on our third grade scholars seesaw page that they're spending time playing games and watching YouTube and watching TV and movies. It's got me thinking a lot about creativity. All of those things are made by someone or a group of people. Someone comes up with the idea for a game and people work together to make that game a reality, whether it's on your computer or the PlayStation or a Game Boy. Somebody creates those YouTube videos that are fun and entertaining for you to watch. Somebody makes and creates those movies and TV shows. So it's got me thinking a lot about how being stuck at home can feel like a bummer, but it can also be fuel and juice for making really cool things. So my question for you is, while we're not at school, while we don't get to see each other and you're at home, what are you doing or what can you be doing to stay creative? Maybe you are like our friend Gabby, who likes to write stories. Maybe you're like my friend Emily, who likes to draw pictures. Maybe you're like me and you're not super artistic, but you really like to color. I'm working on this coloring page when I have spare time. So I'm just curious. Let us know on our third grade scholars seesaw page, what are you doing while you're home to stay creative, to make new things? All right, are you ready to get started with chapter 2 of our chapter book, our story, Because of Winn-Dixie? If you remember in chapter 1, we met Opal. Her name is India Opal, and we learned about how she met her dog Winn-Dixie and took Winn-Dixie home to meet the preacher. But I don't think yet we know how her dad felt about it. They left us by saying, and the two of us, me and Winn-Dixie, started walking home. So you keep what happened in chapter 1 in your mind. As we move on to chapter 2, I want you to be thinking about figurative language. So I'm going to stop a few times to talk about what the author says and whether that's what they really mean. I know in third grade we've talked about figurative language before. We've talked about similes, which is when an author uses the words like or as to compare two things, like he is as tall as a tree. They're comparing a person who is tall and a tree by using like or as. That's a simile, right? And a metaphor is the same thing, except they might call someone something that they're not, okay? But they're still comparing or using something to talk about a person or a thing. And we're gonna see some examples of metaphors and similes in chapter 2 as we read. So I want you to be keeping your brain turned on and thinking about figurative language, similes and metaphors, and how this author or any author might use those to help tell the story, to help paint a picture in our mind. There are a couple of words in this chapter that we might not know. We're going to come across the word missionary, and a missionary is a person who's a part of a church or a religious group who goes to a different country to teach them about what they believe. So if I believe something and I go to a different country to teach those people what I believe in, I would be a missionary. So we see the word missionary, we see the word distracted. If I am distracted, I'm too busy thinking about something else to be present with what's going on. So maybe I'm distracted by the big pile of dishes in my sink, and that means I'm not going to do a good job with this right now. Sometimes we come to school distracted because we were thinking about playing Pokemon with our friends at recess, so we're really not thinking about what's going on in class, right? We've been distracted before. And our last word that we're going to see in this chapter is the word fortunate. And actually in this chapter we see the word less fortunate, which has a prefix of less, right? Which means not or not as much. And fortunate means you have a lot. I am fortunate and I am lucky, I'm well off because I have a place to live and I have food to eat. I am fortunate. And if someone is less fortunate than me, maybe they're not as lucky or they don't have as much. Does that make sense? So we're going to see the words less fortunate, missionary, and distracted as we read. Those are what those words mean, and I'll remind us when we get there. So we're looking for figurative language when we're talking about one thing and meaning something else, or we're comparing two things with like or as. And we're going to see all of those new words. I hope you're ready. I'm so excited. This is a good chapter. Okay, are you ready, Bentley? Chapter 2. That summer I found Winn-Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach, and so in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that is how I got my first name. Remember, missionary means someone who teaches their beliefs to people in a different country. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I had just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher, and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. Remember, he's distracted, which means he's not thinking about what needs to be done, he's thinking about other things. But you know what? I told Winn-Dixie, you are a suffering dog, so maybe he will take to you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you. Winn-Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs. And I have to admit, he stunk bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corner trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cat or Mrs. Detweiler's little yuppie Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. Sit, I told him when we got to my trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. The preacher was sitting in the living room, working at the little fold-out table. He had paper spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he was thinking hard. Daddy, I said. He said back. Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves? Remember, less fortunate means maybe they're not so lucky or they're not so well off. They don't have all the things that we have. Do you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves? He said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his papers. Well, I said, I found the less fortunate at the grocery store. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir, I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding inside its shell, in there thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. I'm going to pause right there because I want us to think about how the author is using words about a turtle to tell us more about the preacher. We already know that the preacher's distracted, right? He's got all these papers around him, he's rubbing his nose and thinking really hard, not really listening to what Opal is saying. And that's why the author and Opal, the narrator in this story, is using this figurative language. He's not really a turtle, but they're using the image in our head of a turtle with his head stuck inside of his shell to tell us about how the preacher is stuck in his own little world, busy with his own papers and sermons and being distracted so much that he's not paying attention to the world around him or to what Opal is saying. Daddy, I was wondering, could this less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while? Finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know it, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. I think that says a lot to what we decided about Opal last time. She's so kind and caring. It's not that she wants the dog. She thinks that the dog, Winn-Dixie, needs her. Look, I said. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn-Dixie! Winn-Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed. And then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer and put his head right on the preacher's lap, right on top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at his ribs and his matted up fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his teeth, all of his crooked yellow teeth, and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the floor. What did you call this dog? The preacher asked. Winn-Dixie, I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn-Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell, which again comes back to that figurative language about the preacher being a turtle. And Winn-Dixie's making him maybe stop being so distracted, stop being in his own little world in his shell so much. Winn-Dixie was making him poke his head out of his shell, or be a little bit more present with what was going on with Opal and Winn-Dixie. Well, said the preacher, he's a stray if I've ever seen one. He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind the ears, and a less fortunate too, that's for sure. Are you looking for a home? The preacher asked, real soft to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail. Well, the preacher said, I guess you found one. I'm so excited that Opal's dad, the preacher, is going to let her keep Winn-Dixie. I'm also very excited about what I'm reading about the effect that Winn-Dixie is having on the preacher. Because I felt, as I was reading this, the way that the author and the narrator used that figurative language made me feel like maybe Opal felt sad that her dad, the preacher, was so distracted and always in his sermons and always in his papers in his show. So I think my prediction is that Winn-Dixie is going to have a good, positive effect on Opal's relationship with her dad. What do you think? What predictions do you have? Until next time, when we read chapter 3, have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye. Say bye, Bentley. Goodbye.